by thanking Dr. Rao, the organizers, for inviting me here. My name is Venkat Padmanabhan. I am with Microsoft Research India. I'll give you a bit of background about myself and then get to some remarks that I want to make. So my background is in computer science. I got my bachelor's degree at IIT Delhi and my master's and PhD at the University of California in Berkeley in the US. And then I've been with Microsoft Research throughout. For the first 8 or 9 years, I was in the US lab. And then for the past 10 years, I've been in the lab in Bangalore, Microsoft Research India. So I'm, neither a pure science person nor even a traditional engineer. I'm computer science, so I will restrict my remarks to what I know about, and what I talk about may not apply to the other areas that the other speakers are touching on. I think Dr. Rao talked about leadership. I think you can think of leadership as two parts. One is institutional building and institutional leadership, and then scientific leadership. I will focus mostly on the scientific leadership part and maybe touch briefly on institutional leadership at the end. I think the single most important thing is having ambition, right? Now, when I say ambition, I don't necessarily just mean sending a man to space or Nobel Prize level ambition. I mean, that is great. That's sort of, for a country, it's good to have that kind of ambition. But as an individual, as a student who is doing a PhD or as a professor in a department, I think the ambition should be to do something that has impact, okay? Now, what does impact mean? I think impact means that some work that you do sitting here, let's say in Tirupati, is being talked about by someone unknown to you on the other side of the world. And there are 3 people in a room discussing something that you wrote here, right? That's impact. Or you produce something in an engineering discipline, let's say you produce some piece of hardware or some software, and other people are copying that or they're building on that. I think that's impact, right? So I think if you decide that you want to do something, you want to solve a problem and solve it in a way that others will actually find interesting and actually be interested in looking at it and maybe copying it, adapting it, I think you're having an impact. You may not win a Nobel Prize for that. I certainly will never win one. And you may not sort of have achieved something big, but I think you've had impact at an individual level. And if more and more people start thinking like that and they come together, I'm sure big things will happen. So I very much advocate a bottom-up approach where individuals change their goals and their sort of behaviors, and I think good things will happen at the institutional level. So let me give some examples from my experience in this context. Well, one thing I would say is that sitting far away from where the action is. I mean, the reality is that Indian science and Indian technology and Indian engineering is not at the forefront in the world, right? There are many other countries, many other institutions that are well ahead. Now, so sitting here, you might think that, what MIT is doing or what a Stanford is doing or what a Berkeley is doing is out of your reach, right? It is like something that they are up there, we are down here. I think, that is in large part not true, right? And I think the thing that is key is, demystification, right? If you actually send a young student to a top international conference and they see what is being presented there, a lot of good work, but they'll get the sense that, that kind of stuff even I can do, right? I saw this work, it's a nice idea, but myself and my colleagues, we can do things like that. I had that experience. Of course, I was already in a US university, but still, I thought, what is being published in these top conferences in my field was unattainable. In the year 1995, I had a chance to go to that conference for the first time. I saw the work. I thought, okay, that kind of stuff even I can do. And as luck would have it, the next year I was able to publish in the same conference, which I thought before going there was beyond my reach. So let me actually give a few examples. So I think in my field, which is computer science, which is really an engineering discipline, which is rapidly changing, one way to have impact or to do work that is impactful is to anticipate technology trends, right? So you look at the world today and you see where it's going and imagine what would be the situation 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and maybe do some work today that might actually see the light of day only 5 or 10 years from now, but you've essentially got into the ground floor of this growing field, and you publish, and then other people will build on your work. So you basically have established yourself as an early leader, right? So one example is in the late 1990s, soon after I finished my PhD, wireless local area networks like Wi-Fi networks. I'm sure all of us use Wi-Fi networks today. But in the late 90s, around 97, 98, those are still yet to take shape. There were experimental hardware available and so on, but Wi-Fi as we know it, or 802.11, the protocol standard, didn't exist. So along with a colleague, I got together with him and we brainstormed and we said, things like, we couldn't call it Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi didn't exist, but radio frequency based local area networks to connect computers will happen. Okay, it seems like a very convenient thing. People will want wireless communication. Then we went one step ahead and said, okay, if you assume a world where Wi-Fi or the equivalent of Wi-Fi is everywhere, what can you do with it? And we worked on this problem of what's called indoor positioning or indoor localization. So you all know GPS, right? GPS allows you to figure out your location anywhere in the world, except that in indoor spaces, whether it's office buildings or malls or airports, it doesn't quite work for many reasons. And the reality is that people spend the majority of their time indoors. So if you're trying to track, for example, a person in an indoor space to sort of guide them from point A to point B, or maybe you're trying to deliver some information to them that is relevant to their particular location, whether they are in a particular store looking at a particular product and so on, you can't use GPS. So we said, okay, if you assume a world where RF-based wireless communication is everywhere, can we repurpose that same communication without any additional hardware for doing indoor localization? So we did a piece of work that we call radar, which is not the real radar, we just called it radar, and published it in, we did the work in around 1998 and published it in the year 2000, and that really took off. I mean, there's an entire field of work, our paper has been cited about 8,500 times, just because a lot of people found that, okay, this is a very good idea, we can improve it, right? And of course, we ourselves did some work following up. Another example, which I actually did in India, soon after moving back to India in 2007, smartphones were still in the early days. They didn't have any of the sensors we take for granted today, accelerometers, gyroscopes, and so on. But, my colleagues and I said, okay, seems like things like sensors will happen in smartphones just because sensors are getting cheaper. Seems like a useful package to have. What can we do with it? And so we did a piece of work on monitoring road conditions, roads like potholes and so on, and traffic conditions using just a smartphone. And our piece of work was called Nericell, and that also took off. A lot of follow-up work, startups have done that kind of work. And even my employer, Microsoft, has benefited from some of these in terms of the patents we did and so on. So these are just a couple of examples. Now in computer science, the field I work in, resource constraints is no longer an excuse. Computers and devices have become cheap enough that even in a modest university, you can get your hands on the hardware that you need. I think what is required is thinking about problems and thinking with the intention of working on something that others will find interesting. Right? You're not doing it just because you want to get your degree and move on. You want to do something where you've broken new ground, you feel you've broken new ground, and others will find interesting. You may not succeed every time, but if you work with that mindset, I think you will succeed. One final bit is about institutional leadership. Again, from my experience at Microsoft, I think one of the things that the Indian system still doesn't have is this notion that the best institutional leaders are not the most senior people or the oldest person, right? In our organization, we have many layers. I'm low down in the hierarchy, but our executive vice president was actually a graduate student of some people that are 3 levels below him in the organization. But the fact is that he is good at what he does, and the people who are below him, who are scientists, are good at what they do, and it just works fine, right? I think it will take a while for that culture to change in India, but I think that is required before we can expect institutions to really flourish in India. Thank you.